Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine that is one of the leading wines from the southern French region, the Languedoc. This is Mas de Daumas Gassac Rouge, the 2020 vintage of that. And this is a wine that's labelled as an IGP from St Guilhem-le-Désert. Now, it was back in 1970 that Aimé Guibert and his wife Veronique bought a property about 40 kilometres west of Montpellier. Veronique was a lecturer at the university and Aimé Guibert was a leather worker. And they bought what was a very run-down property that had been owned by an old man who lived there with his two sisters. He farmed the area and there was livestock living in the ground floor of the house. They kept animal feed in the top floor. There was no electricity, there was no running water. This was an unspoilt location in the remote Gassac Valley. And it was here that the Guiberts, for some reason, chose, despite the fact they had no background in producing fine wine, to set out to make a wine that would be the equivalent of a Grand Cru. And there was the confluence of a number of things. Firstly, some exceptional people with the vision to think that in an area where the majority of wines being made were sort of cheap, everyday table wines, that they could make a wine of this quality. Second, it was the fact that there was a soil type here that was very particular. A friend of Aimé Guibert's, somebody called Henri Engelbert, was a soil scientist, and he pointed out to his friend that the soils here were similar to the sort of soils that were found in some of the Grand Crus in Burgundy. There was a fractured limestone with an iron-rich loam between it in the bottom part of the valley, and that's where Cabernet Sauvignon has been grown very successfully. So there was a fantastic soil type. But at the same time, the Gassac Valley actually again modifies the climate of this region, giving a wonderful cooling influence. So actually in what is an area with quite a warm Mediterranean climate, Mas de Daumas Gassac actually has quite a cool climate by comparison, particularly cool evenings, a very large diurnal temperature variation. And these factors have combined to make this one of the most successful estates in the Languedoc today. The Guiberts were ahead of their time in many ways. I mean, the approach that they've always taken has always been to be sustainable. I don't think they're actually certified as such, but their approach has always been organic, and they've always believed in biodiversity. When they first came here, the estate had been farmed, but I believe the old man who'd only ever used a horse to plough had found it more difficult, and had only been cultivating the areas closest to the house. So most of the estate was actually overgrown. But prior to that, this area had really only been used by charcoal burners. You know, there are signs of there having been agriculture here. There were sort of stone walls remaining once the scrub had been cleared. But for instance, when they came to clear space to plant vineyards, they decided, I think largely as a result of Veronique's insistence, that they wouldn't cut down any trees. I mean, this wasn't a forested area, this was just scrub, the garrigue. And so those trees that were there were left, and today actually the vineyards are now surrounded by trees, and that's actually been a benefit in terms of the biodiversity it gives, and actually in terms of how that modifies the climate. The trees are very good at retaining some humidity, and also sometimes they guide storms around the vineyards. But all these ideas were sort of way ahead of their time back in the early 70s. Also very impressive was the care with which Aimé Guibert set out to produce his wine. For instance, the Cabernet Sauvignon, and this is a predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon based wine, normally about 70%. The care with which he selected the vine cuttings was very impressive. He managed to find a nursery that had cuttings that had come from Bordeaux, from Cru Classé estates, although those names aren't given, but that had been collected prior to phylloxera. Evidently this nursery was in Lyon, somewhere like that, and so these were pre-phylloxera cuttings of Cabernet Sauvignon from Bordeaux that were planted here. Now the 2020 growing season was preceded by a cold winter, but there were no frosts, and actually the development throughout the year was very regular, and the fruit developed in balanced conditions. There were no summer heat spikes, so temperatures would go up to about 28 degrees during the day, and then, you know, just to illustrate the way that this particular location works, temperatures were coming down to nighttime temperatures of 10 to 12 degrees. Just allowing the grapes to retain acidity and to retain their aromas. And the fruit was ripening well. Then on the 15th of August came a very welcome storm, just providing enough water to the vineyards to bring the vines back to life and to give them just a couple of weeks to finish ripening the fruit. Picking for the reds started on the 3rd of September and went on for 17 days, finishing on the 21st. And just that revigoration that the rain had given was enough to turn this into quite an exceptional vintage. Now the blend of this wine, as I say, typically this is about 70% Cabernet Sauvignon. So in 2020 there was 71% of Cabernet Sauvignon. There was then 6% of Syrah, 5% of Tannat, 4% of Merlot, 3% of Cabernet Franc, 3% of Petit Verdot, 2% of Malbec, 2% of Pinot Noir, and then they say 4% of other varietals. Vine age in the vineyard averages about 43 years. So these are mature vines giving quite concentrated fruit. Picking went on by hand. All the picking at this state is done that way. And the Cabernet Sauvignon is fermented separately and the other varieties are co-fermented. Fermentation goes on with temperature control in stainless steel tanks. Maceration is traditional as per Bordeaux for a long period with an amount of pump overs, and that went on for about 20 days. The wine then aged for 12 to 15 months in oak. The oak being used was French oak. A portion would have been new, but there were equal proportions of barrels up to 7 years old. So there's not a huge proportion of new oak going into this. Rather, I think they prefer to allow the fruit to express itself. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? The colour is deep, it's dark, it's almost opaque. I can just about make out the stem of the glass through it. So that makes that quite deep and dark for Mas de Daumas Gassac. There's a slight purple note to the red colour, and it's staining the glass. Now this is 13.5% alcohol, and there's a certain amount of viscosity there. The wine is slowly forming tears on the side of the glass as I swirl it. The aromas have a lovely, fresh, initially black currant note. There actually is a sort of a real cassis note. Cassis with touches of plum, but there's almost a sort of a graphite note in there, and an underlying clean black cherry, but not a sort of an enormous juicy note. There are perhaps red currant notes as well. It's that sort of lifted, fresh red to black fruit on the aromas. Very attractive indeed. So let's have a taste. On the palate there's a freshness and a perfume that's very apparent from the outset. I mean, you start off again with that cassis note, but quite quickly go to a sort of a concentrated, slight bitter licorice note, an anise, a freshness really still coming through there, that's stopping the core from being too concentrated and licoricey. There really is a juicy freshness that's taking it on to a black cherry note. You've got hints of graphite coming in there, and then you're finishing with more of this sort of cassis fruit. There's a lovely mouth-watering nature to this. The tannins, the structure is very fine. There certainly is a grip, but it's not as stringent and drying. You know, there's just enough bitterness there that the richness is balancing it nicely. The alcohol's not out of balance at all. There's adding a little bit of warmth and roundness to the finish, but it's certainly not smothering the fruit on the finish, because the fruit has good power and it's lifted so nicely by that acidity that you've got that lovely cassis freshness right to the end there. I think this really is showing that the beautiful, slow ripening, cool climate fruit that particularly in 2020 is very evident. This is a very pretty wine. It's a very perfumed wine. It's got such lovely balance. I'm sure it'll age very happily for at least 20 years if you want to, but it's very accessible, very attractive now. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this. It gets 92 out of 100. I think there'd be an argument to say it could do slightly better than that, but I think that's a pretty fair score for it. Maybe as a wine, its elegance and its gentleness, rather than being a wine of power and weight, perhaps doesn't quite push it forward in terms of people giving high scores, but the lovely persistence of the flavours and the freshness of the flavours I think are really quite special. I do like this wine, and I think this is a lovely example of Mas de Daumas Gassac. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, please do sign up and follow us. It would be fantastic to have your support there. If you have any comments you'd like to leave, please pop those in the comments box below. We'd really appreciate your feedback on what we're doing as far as tastings, the wines we're looking at, and things related to that. I'll leave a link in the notes so that you can follow that to the web page for this wine, this vintage of this wine, on the Wine Searcher website, and there you can find out about pricing, availability, and any other background information we have. If you'd like to share the tasting with friends that you think might be interested, we'd really appreciate that as well. That would be fantastic. But most importantly, I do hope you'll manage to take some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.